We're in for a real treat with Dr. Grob, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at USC, or should I say U of SC, Sumter, one of the Palmetto College campuses in the university system. She's an active member of the American Association of Philosophy Teachers, which is a premier organization in North America dedicated to the advancement and support of excellence in teaching philosophy. She serves on several committees there and has led and co-led several workshops on teaching and learning at U of SC Sumter. So what we're going to be hearing is not some disconnected, sterile approach to metacognition, but we have someone who walks the talk. So if there's anything more that she wants to share about herself, she will. Welcome, Dr. Grob, and the mic is yours.
Hello, everyone. I am so delighted to have you here with me. Thanks so much for the introduction. I am Dr. Grob. You can just call me Christina, though. That's totally fine. And I have been teaching my classes with and for metacognition pretty much since I started teaching, that is. And I want to say a few things about how this session is going to work. I'm probably going to end up doing a lot more of the talking in this session than I will in the next two, and that's for a variety of reasons, including the fact that we're just starting and we're just developing this community, and so you might need a little bit more time to sit and listen and think and reflect in this session, and then in the other two we'll be doing a lot more workshopping in these sessions so that you can leave the sessions overall with some really practical things that you can try in your classes. So I'm going to be explaining this a little bit through my own story, like how I came to learn about and use metacognition, and I'm doing that for a number of reasons. I want to help to show you what it looks like in real time. I didn't have real fancy principle-driven reasons for designing for metacognition, as will become much clearer. And I'm hoping that by showing you throughout this entire session that I came to this because I had problems that I had to solve. And so I was looking for ways to solve problems in my classes, that you too can start already thinking about that even as I'm talking. So if you're half listening, half taking notes, because you're already thinking about things that you can do, that is wonderful. And you should have a chance to be able to talk about that in the breakout sessions and when we're discussing in the larger group. So, you know, thinking back to like little baby me, you know, as I was first coming to start teaching, what kinds of training did I have about this? And the short answer is none. I got no guidance in how to become a teacher from my graduate program. There were no pedagogy workshops or trainings, either discipline specific or otherwise. I only got 1 year as a teaching assistant, which meant only 1 year to look at what philosophy faculty were doing within undergraduate classrooms. There wasn't really a strong community of scholarship of teaching and learning in my program or the grad school at the time, although weirdly, a bunch of us who were in my grad program at the same time are now very active in the American Association of Philosophy Teachers. So we've all become that, but we didn't get that from our program. And then, you know, the bottom one, you know, natural confidence. Oh, please. I mean, goodness, I'm terribly nervous talking to you all right now. Skills in building rapport with students. Oh, no, right? I had none of these things, right? And so, again, problems to solve. So my very first experience teaching was summer courses, because there was a real worry that I was going to graduate with my doctoral degree without having had any experience as an instructor of record. So a concession was made to allow me to teach, even though I had a 12-month assistantship in the graduate school. And so my first experience as an instructor of record was to meet with my undergraduate students 3 hours a day, 3 times a week, which I'm really hoping that you're feeling really, really bad for me right now, because that's a terrible way for a little baby teacher to start, right? There was no mentoring, no guidance, nothing, just me and whatever it is I was going to do. You can imagine the results, right? So I've pitched this sort of like it was the opening scene to a play that none of us wants to go see. Maybe I should have given it a title. Maybe you can come up with a title for me. But basically, you know, students enter the room. They don't make eye contact for the most part. They might bring out their notebooks. Someone's got a laptop. Everyone else is on their phones. They're barely even talking to each other. And then you're like, okay, great. I'm so excited. We're going to talk about the reading that you all did. So who's got questions? And they're just like, that's cute. And they don't make eye contact. And then later on course evals, they're like, oh my gosh, it was so unclear. And she didn't answer any of my questions and did nothing to engage us. And you're like, what was I supposed to have done, right? So I had two choices at this point, really. I could give the students what they said they wanted, and they indicated that they wanted more lecturing, better lecturing, lecturing at all. They wanted me to tell them what the text meant. They wanted me to tell them what would be on the test. They wanted me to stop trying to push them to interact because they didn't want to do so. Or I could teach students to do what I wanted. And I was imagining basically something that could become one of those really inspiring feel-good movies, right? Where I'm the inspirational teacher and all of the students are like coming to class, like basically falling over each other, you know, with questions and, you know, working together to like pursue truth. And it was going to be beautiful, right? So these are my two options, at least as far as I could see it. And here is my extremely scientific, principled way of having made my decision. I don't have the vocal strength to talk for 3 hours. I barely have the vocal strength to talk with any kind of projection or inflection so I don't sound like I'm dead inside for like 50 minutes. Like that would be like the outer limit. Like this right now is going to exhaust my voice for the rest of the day. So it was really physical capacity that made my decision for me. I couldn't do what they wanted simply because I wasn't physically capable of it. So I was going to have to teach them to engage the class the way I wanted. I was going to have to give them a lot more instruction for how to read, like what I meant by that. Because they were, I mean, it's not like they weren't, it's not as though they weren't looking over the readings. They were, it turns out, but they weren't getting much out of them. They couldn't explain what they'd read, and they certainly couldn't ask questions about it. They didn't know how to ask questions, so I was going to have to teach them how to ask questions. So I had to then do this, you know, some kind of training that way in order to get the kind of classes I wanted. So this leads me to takeaway number one for our session. It doesn't really matter how you're arriving at whatever stage you are where you want to level up, you got there, right? I didn't have like these pure lofty pedagogical principles or ideals when I was designing my classes for metacognition. I had a practical, physical, and emotional problem where I was like, this class is painful. I can barely face my students because like we can't fill the time together and this is bad. And I can't talk at them for 3 hours. What am I going to do? Had I had more experience, if my classes were shorter, I might have become a better lecturer in the way that I approach classes. But I didn't. So I was put in a position early on where I failed. I had some real failures in my teaching. And those failures led me to having to figure out a solution to those problems. And that's an idea that's going to come up a little bit later on in our discussion today. So I had to go about fixing the problem. I'm going to explain that a little bit. So I had my own sense of the problems that I wanted to fix, right? The students were coming to class without having done the reading. And this was happening especially once I started teaching at the community college in Chicago. They didn't have questions though, either after they had done the reading or even if they'd done the reading before class. They're like, no, I did it. Okay, well, what questions do you have? I don't have any questions. But their performance on papers or tests or quizzes were showing that they should have had questions because they weren't really understanding. If I asked them to bring questions or if they were able to come up with questions, they were all quiz type questions, right? They weren't the kind of question that you could discuss that would lead to further questions. They were things like, on page 37 of McGuire's book, she talks about the value of blooms. What does she mean, right? Where there's like a knowable, findable right answer. And that wasn't leading anywhere. When students were faced with words they didn't understand or the usage of words they didn't understand, when they were faced with names or terms or whatever that they hadn't seen before, instead of becoming curious and looking them up, they were shutting down. they were moving right over those terms and hoping to figure it out in context. For texts that are written for a general audience, that is often a pretty good strategy. But for things that are written for disciplinary audiences, where words are being used in a specific disciplinary context, that's often a terrible strategy because they're not learning the discipline-specific meanings of words to help them to understand the specific concepts that are being described or explained. And then all of the work they were doing, in terms of papers, quizzes, whatever, was showing that they really weren't getting it. So those were the things I wanted to fix. On the student end, things were a little bit different. They didn't like their grades. So in that sense, their response was a little more practical than mine, right? They thought they were putting in so much effort, but their effort and their grades weren't lining up. And so they thought their grades should have been higher, and they couldn't see that they hadn't actually achieved the outcomes that we needed to get to in the class. They didn't see why I kept pushing for class discussions, and it seemed to them like it was just a way for me to pass the time because I was too lazy to teach. What they wanted instead were 50-minute or an hour and 15-minute lectures. They wanted then exhaustive lecture notes, and then they wanted study guides, and they wanted to be able to use those to basically then pull the answers there to go straight onto tests and quizzes so that they would be able to know that they got the right answers. And especially at the community college level, they kept asking me for homework and quizzes so that they could get regular feedback and basically proof that they were staying on track. And so they also wanted something different. Students were also unhappy. I was not about to start designing homework for them because that sounded like too much work for me. Same with quizzes. I was not going to start writing new quizzes every week. Like that to me seemed like a huge time suck. And then grading them, like no, I wasn't going to do that, but I was going to do something, right? So what I ended up doing was designing something that was going to change how they were looking at learning. Now, this is also a backwards interpretation. I didn't start by thinking what I have to do is change their view of learning. I realized after the fact that what I designed was effective because it changed students' view of learning. So this just comes from a document on high impact teaching practices. There's lots of things that can be really effective. I designed an assignment that helped them to reframe what learning looks like. And so I designed what I called a daily writing assignment, which is a bit of a misnomer because they weren't really writing them every single day. It was more like for every class period. And so what I started requiring was for students to come to every single class period, basically proving that they'd engaged with the reading. So I required like an actual physical document that they would bring to class every single time. And it went through a few iterations, but I started by requiring them to come up with at least 2 questions per class period and to have given some documentation of what they had to look up to understand the text. I wanted to normalize having to look words up if you didn't know them. As I kept doing them, and because they were so successful, I added 2 more sections ultimately. So what connections were they able to make between what they read and then things that they knew from outside the reading? And then also their best formulation of the main point of the reading. These were a template, so I didn't have to come up with a brand new assignment or to write specific new questions for a quiz every week. It was the exact same assignment for every class period. So it was really easy to remember. It was just a structure you could figure out. I was able to give them real-time feedback on their understanding of the main points. And they were able to practice asking questions and to get better at doing it over time. This ended up being super successful. So this leads to takeaway number 2. Whatever we're frustrated by in the classroom, this is the ground for pedagogical innovation. Like this is how we end up creating the classes we want, is by taking the things that bother us the most and trying to figure out something that can address it. Not everything that we design is going to work to address it, but everything is going to get us closer to how we can, come up with something that's going to work, right? So we can design for the kind of learners or the kind of students that we want. And we can help students to cultivate the learning skills that we're looking for by shaping our courses in order to emphasize those skills. So at this point, you're like, okay, we're like, 14 slides in, we are, 15 minutes, 16 minutes, right, into this presentation, and I barely even talked about metacognition. So come on, where's, this is like a bait and switch, right? So I noticed like my students were doing really, really well in my classes. And when I got to USC Sumter, I was doing the daily writing assignment because it worked really great. I've done it now every school that I've taught at. And my first semester here, student grades were really strong. And I was able to talk about how I kept students on track with the work, with what I was doing. But I also didn't have the theory or the language to talk about why what I was doing worked so well. And so that was a point of confusion with the peer review committee, which makes sense. So I had to then go into the scholarship of teaching and learning to figure out why what I did worked. And that's when I got to the literature on metacognition. And as soon as I started reading about metacognition, it was like light bulbs going off in my head. It was like, oh, what I've been doing works because what it's doing is helping students with their cognitive, but also their metacognitive skills. And so that then became the ground for, future development for me. So it's like, okay, this is what I'm already doing. Now I can do it on purpose and I can do it better. So metacognition, the basic way to think about it is that it's just like thinking about thinking, right? It's like cognition, just meta. It's becoming aware of the thinking moves that you're using while you're trying to think around something. It's like a suite of mental skills that you have. It's becoming aware of how you're using the skills and how well you're using them, right? I really like the last from the bottom explanation or example, being able to accurately judge our own level of learning. And that idea is going to come back later on today, and then it's definitely in session 2, where like our students are really bad at noticing whether or not they've understood something. And they are heavily reliant on us to tell them if we think they've learned something. But that's not helpful if what we're trying to do is to turn them into lifelong learners, right? They're going to have to figure out if they've learned something on their own. And if they can't figure that out, they're not going to be lifelong learners. So when we teach students in ways that strengthen their metacognitive skills, they become increasingly independent of us, and that's awesome. So there's a number of different skills, which I'm going to get to in like the next 2 slides that we're talking about when it comes to cognition. And there's different ways to represent them. So we're going to be focusing primarily on Bloom in most of these sessions. That's not the only way of thinking about either cognition or metacognition, obviously. And I'm going to see if I can find a few more resources to add to what we have. But Bloom is one that everyone knows, or like a lot of people know, and so it's a touchstone for a lot of people. So that's one way of looking at it. Robert Ennis has some really awesome criticism or critiques of Bloom, and so maybe I'll reproduce this for session 2 or session 3. But here's like a really basic and easy to find representation of Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive skills. And it's very often represented in pyramid form. And it's represented in such a way that remembering and understanding are at the bottom. And these are often considered or called the lower order cognitive skills, the ones that are the most basic. And then applying on up through creating are considered higher order or higher level cognitive skills. However, this is one of the reasons for some of the criticisms. We really only see the strength of our lower order skills and remembering or understanding by seeing how they show up in our ability to apply or analyze or evaluate or create. So it's not as though we're saying that you should create instead of understanding or that you should analyze instead of remembering. Rather, you can demonstrate the strength of your understanding by showing like the breadth of your analysis or your evaluation. So that would be one way of looking at it. Here's an even awesomer representation, and thanks so much to Kathy for sending this to me because this is like super cool. So this adds another dimension. So you still see the cognitive processes in color along the right side, but then it's also adding a knowledge dimension. And you can also see a lot more verbs here. Those are all the words in red. And so it's nice to compare this with the verb sheet that I had put into our session on Blackboard as well. So having a wider range of verbs to consider when we're looking at each of these different cognitive skills helps us to see, A, that all of these cognitive skills are actions. They're things that we're doing. They're mental actions that we take. But also getting to see different ways of thinking about, all of the different actions that get, sort of housed under the umbrella terms that we see in this sort of basic taxonomy here. That helps us to see a lot more of the different things that we're doing. So instead of just seeing sort of create, evaluate, analyze, whatever, being able to also think about like judging and integrating and assembling or carrying out or clarifying, things like that. It's like, oh yeah, of course, I do those things. I do those in my class. I do this or that. So there's lots of ways of representing these visually, and that can be really helpful, not just for us as educators when we're thinking about what it is we're doing in the classroom, but then later if we want to share with students the different cognitive skills that we're working on with them and through our assignments, to be able to show them like this so that they get to see, oh gosh, wow, I'm doing this really fancy, smart thing. This is amazing. And that can be really helpful as well. So now we have finally gotten to the long-awaited first breakout session. And so we're going to be paired up into groups of 2. And what I'd like for you to do is really just talk about things you're doing and you're teaching already right now that connect you to any of the cognitive skills in Bloom's taxonomy. I'm curious to hear where you already saw yourselves, where these cognitive skills show up in your classes, etc., what you were discussing, etc. So you can share in the chat, you can use your microphones and your voices. So I'd like to hear a little bit from you all before I keep going with my stuff. Yeah, please, James.
Yeah, so I am James. I teach at the Greenville School of Medicine. And I think one of the problems we encounter is that the students want to learn all of the factoids and just regurgitate those. So of course we have standardized licensing exams that the students are very nervous about. We teach them in laboratory all about the human body and physiology. And even though we challenge them to integrate the information and apply it in given situations, they still fall back on learning the factoid so that they can spit it out next time they see it. And the problem is trying to get them to approach and understand the system instead of the fact. Yeah. And to be able to understand how the system will apply in any situation. So if they learn the system, then they can use that knowledge to apply it. And so, we're always fighting that instinct of the students, and they've learned this throughout, starting in, first grade, learn that they're supposed to regurgitate facts onto a sheet of paper. Yes. And so it's this constant battle to try to get them to think about the system and understanding that system and testing themselves on their knowledge of the system instead of just creating flashcards for factoids. Yeah. So that was what most of our discussion in Group 7 kind of revolved around in my experience and my partner's experience in his different field, but still very similar issues.
Yeah, awesome. That's a fantastic starting point for thinking more about this as we keep going. Thanks for sharing too, and for being the first person to share, which is always the hardest thing to do. Lee's got her hand up too, so Lee, please join us.
We actually found a couple of things. My partner teaches only one class many times, and I have a range of classes, something like 12 different classes over a few years. And so she has a ton of examples of when she can use metacognition. I'm struggling because I'm teaching this class for the first time. So that's one. It's kind of like if you have more teaching responsibilities in terms of numbers of different types of classes, it's harder to start fitting in examples. The second thing is I also teach anatomy and physiology, and I believe our last speaker does too. And for them to understand a lot of the concepts, they need to also understand the terms.
Mhm.
And there is just a huge number of terms. You know, when you have 50 new vocabulary words per chapter and you have, 15 chapters. So it really becomes a challenge to, like, do you emphasize the vocabulary, and do you emphasize concepts, and it just gets really convoluted. It's like, which really has priority, because we only have a set amount of time.
Yeah, yeah. These are really great questions. Thanks so much for sharing. Hayes, yeah.
So the diagram of the steps of Bloom's taxonomy, the 3D one, I was zeroing in on deconstruct your own biases, because I feel like that's something that cuts across every class I teach, but especially the critical thinking ones that the freshmen are in. And it's really hard to get them to do that, because of course they either don't have any biases, or they happen to have the correct biases, or we all have biases, therefore I don't have to think about mine. And so that's one of the reasons I'm here, is like, I do a little bit of this metacognition with them, but I'm just very eager to do more, because it's so much at the heart of what I'm trying to do in the first place with these classes.
Yeah, totally. Thank you. Thanks for that. Brett.
What I found, like, I mean, is that like, I teach physics, and I mean, the basic methodology is learn for particularly advanced classes that I teach mostly, is learning a suite of problem solving techniques. And so there are, like, the middle stages in the like the understand, apply, and analyze are all more or less run together into one thing, where the problem is you're given some set of data which characterizes a system physically or mathematically, and then you need to figure out what is the right mathematical tools to work out to pull out other information. Now, I mean, there's very little of the beyond the 200 level classes of the just recall of what we're describing. There is more like in the upper level things, like, figuring out, like, is this a good setup for an experimental detector? Will this make sense? Can we design something better? But the intermediate stages all run together, because what the most important thing for students is to figure out what is the right mathematical technique to use. And often, and the metacognition aspect of that is particularly that if they don't, like, if sometimes they can see, oh, this is kind of this problem, I'll use this technique, and the whole thing then falls out relatively straightforwardly. But if you don't recognize what is the technique to use, then they can just go around and round in circles and not get anywhere, and not realize that they're missing the key technique.
Yeah, so not even noticing when it's not working. Absolutely. So one of the things that I want to say too is, like, it sounds like for a number of the folks teaching in STEM fields, like, it seems like there seems to be more of a tension between, like, say, vocabulary and, getting to, like, different order skills. And that's something that I want to address just really briefly right now, is to say, yeah, most of my examples are definitely humanities based, but a lot of the literature that I've read is mostly from STEM fields. So between that, we should end up ultimately by the end of this getting a pretty good balance. So Kathy put in the chat, whoa, so you laid out the taxonomy and your assignments, okay, and then plotted each to build through. So that sounds really, really great. Libby, yeah, please.
So I am an acting teacher, and so a lot of these sort of practices are innate within, sort of disciplinary standards. But as I'm listening to a lot of our colleagues in the STEM field speak about their experiences, I will say that, like, I do collaborate a lot with other professors at our institution to bring sort of like elements of embodiment to their classes and then to incorporate some of this work into, I've worked in like a MATLAB class. I've also done work with, I'm doing a collaboration with a colleague in math right now to sort of figure out ways that we can bring sort of kinesthetic and create sort of examples, you know, like physicalized examples of like, you know, functions in the classroom so that the students really have to sort of take that knowledge and literally embody it. But, you know, I also do a lot of stuff with simulated patient work. And I think as I was listening to James talk about some of the issues, I think like adding that human element where there's like the need to then like code switching, right? Like from these concepts and these ideas that then have to be like translated to another human being that is not as aware. It really shows the gaps in what is missing in terms of understanding, right? And so that can be really helpful too. And so I think like collaboration obviously helps us deconstruct our biases, but also it illuminates what is missing in the students and in the curriculum.
Yes. Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And way to set up for like some of the stuff that I'm going to be sharing in the later part of this presentation. So this is awesome. Thank you all for what you've been sharing. I'm going to keep moving on and like let's keep this discussion going. So thank you for the wide range of stuff. And so, and like one of the undertones here is like, okay, so like there's these things, but like what do I do now? Right? So, okay, there's these skills and maybe they show up, maybe they don't, or maybe I am teaching way too many classes for me to even notice where they're showing up because like it's just too much, etc. So what do we do, right, given all of this? So one of the things, like it looks like I'm switching gears, but not totally. One of the things that that we want to talk about then is like, okay, so we can tell that there are various cognitive skills that are at play in our classes, whether students like it or want to play along or not. Why is it so hard to sell this on students, right? Most of us here already are like, yeah, I mean, this is a great idea. I want to do more of it. And our students are like, yeah, nope. Just tell me what's going to be on the test because like that's literally the only thing I care about. Or if it coincides with something I'm already doing, then maybe. But if it doesn't, then like, sorry, but no. So I want us to talk about this and basically talk about this as a problem that we can solve so that then we can apply that to all of our own particular situations. So these are three of the main reasons why it is that students don't really have strong metacognitive skills, and they're really interconnected, right? So the first is that they've gotten by just fine until they've gotten to like our class or they've gotten to the level that they're at. So when something's not broken, we don't tend to fix it because it looks like it's just fine. So students have done okay or okay enough. And this means that they haven't been very motivated to learn new ways of learning because everything they've been doing about learning has been okay enough to them. You know, they expect to learn at a certain level, and this is really connected to the growth and fixed mindset stuff that's coming up very shortly. I mean, how often do you have students who say things like, well, you know, I'm like about a B student, and then so they expect to get a B, they might get a B, and they're like, great, I'm done. And they don't actually do much work to go further. Or you get students who are like, I'm an A student, and so you must be wrong in how you graded me because I'm always an A student, and so therefore you are wrong to give me this B or this C. So students have this idea of like where they think they are in some sort of like essentialist way. And so whenever things reinforce that, they just take it and they don't do anything more about it. And when things don't reinforce it, instead of thinking, wait a minute, maybe there's no like sort of grade essentialism where you have C students who are like C's in their souls. Maybe there's just learning and you can do more or less of it and you can find different ways to do it. And that also connects to the growth and fixed mindset stuff. So that, I mean, a lot of our students, and especially our students who are not performing as well as they want to, will revert to language that gets to the fixed and growth mindset stuff. And I'm not sure we see it as much like in like the sort of fine details. We more get it in like broad categories. Like we get students who say things like, I'm just not a math and science person. Like, put me in an arts class and it's great. Or you get students who are like, I am just not a humanities and arts person. Put me in a math and science class and it's super great. So often in these like broad categorizations, we see this. And so students who are like, no, I really prefer math and science classes because there's right answers. And I'm just like, oh, that's adorable. Once you get further up, there's not. So that's really great. They don't believe me, for one, and they don't care. They want right answers. And then students who don't necessarily, who are like, oh, I just can't really handle math and science, they think they're all just bullshitting anyway in their arts and humanities classes, and that's what they like doing. So in neither case are they correct, but they also don't understand why they're not correct. So we can solve these problems, not solve, we can meet these problems head on. So we can take these as things that we can design for, right? So if students have always gotten by, then we can design our classes so they get early and recoverable failure early on that is assigned to them. They've got to do something different. So when students get a really early experience of safe failure, they are way more interested in learning how to avoid that in the future. And that all automatically opens students up to trying something new that we might suggest to them that they otherwise are not willing to do. So these are some things that we can do. We can design our assignments to require deeper engagement. So if, for example, we're just saying what was the right answer, we might get a lot of really high grades. If we start saying, why is this the right answer, grades might go down, but students are going to learn that they have to go even deeper. It's not enough just to have right answers. You've got to have right answers for the right reasons. And if we can design our assignments or our assessments to be able to do that, they can see the gaps in their understanding a lot faster than when we're just saying what was like the right answer about this thing. I confess, I don't give any kind of assignment or assessment where there would be anything like a right answer. So if I sound like I'm out of my depth, I totally am. But a lot of you might have something like that as well. Low stakes stuff, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of doing tons of low stakes work so that students have many, many opportunities for recoverable failure. And I will have, at least as resources, some essays that, again, will be from philosophy, but from philosophers who are pedagogically minded, who design their classes for failure, so that students have lots of opportunities for that. Students don't love it until much later on, but it's effective. When students think that they're as smart as they need to be, then we can invite them to level up by making it fun, right? And by this, I don't mean entertainment. I mean really being conscious about the ways that we might be, without even thinking about it, reproducing language that says something like this class is a job or it's work. And I mean, we all know that jobs are not fun, right? I mean, we're all having fun here right now, and that's great. But in like, job is not fun. Job is job. But you don't want to necessarily level up just for funsies if you don't have to, right? So instead, make it seem attractive. And we can do that, again, by offering really targeted, specific, but limited advice in one small thing they can improve. And as students start to see small ways to improve, then it's a lot easier to gamify the work, right? So you can look at it like, I mean, the whole thing, right? At the disciplinary level, at a large sense, and all the way down to the assignment level. It's a game they can figure out. And once the rules become clearer, then success or increased success also becomes a lot easier to reach for or to aim for and to do. And for students who have a fixed mindset, and this comes from Carol Dweck's work on fixed versus growth mindsets, and I understand that some of that has come under critique recently, there still seems to be something about it, because our students will use this language where they just think they're this kind of person or that kind of person. And, you know, I'm pretty opposed to essentialisms of all kinds, so I'm just like, no, this is not a thing. That's not enough to convince our students, but that's okay. So when we get students to see evidence of their learning, that can be really powerful in helping students to get up for, or to go beyond like this mindset stuff. So for example, I do midpoint and final self-assessments in my classes. They're heavily guided. So I'm not just saying, so tell me what you've learned, or have you learned anything? Because then students are going to be like, yep, I've learned stuff, and then they don't go any deeper. I remind them of the criteria, I guide their assessments, and students are then able to gauge their own learning with increasing power throughout the semester. And as they do that, they're like, oh, wait a minute, things are different. Another thing that I've done is I have invited students to compare their weekly reflections, which is what I do now in online classes, or their daily writing assignments from the early part of the semester to the ones they're doing in the later part of the semester. And I ask them to talk about what's changed. And they're like, oh my gosh, wow, I'm asking so much better questions. And so getting students to notice how they've already grown, like in real time, is really helpful in getting students to see that they are actually capable of becoming better than they were. And that can help to combat their beliefs that that's not possible, even if they don't realize they've had them. So takeaway number 3, students have pretty good reasons for not having these skills yet, but we can design our classes to help to build those skills. So we've already talked a little bit about the reasons why our students are coming to our classes without the kind of cognitive skills or the metacognitive skills that we're looking for, right? I mean, it's a lifetime, but also a culture of high stakes learning. They get pressure from all kinds of corners, right, to perform really well, so that the school looks good, so that they look good, so they get into a good college, so they get a good job, etc. And it's a lot of pressure. You know, they've had lots and lots of text-to-test, like straight-up classes. And, you know, so then when they get to college classes where they get tests that go beyond what the text said, they're like, I don't know what to do because that wasn't in the text, that wasn't in the lecture. And now you're asking me to like extrapolate. I don't know how to extrapolate. All of these things, right? They don't yet have the skills for deep, higher level learning, but those are all things that we can incentivize in our classes so that they're able to do so. And in our second session, we'll be talking a lot more specifically about things that we can suggest for students, but also design for students. So we'll talk a lot more explicitly about the study cycle that Sandra McGuire teaches in her book and in her workshops and sessions and things like that. And that's even more geared toward STEM type fields than it is to non-STEM type fields. But it's applicable broadly to pretty much everybody. So first I want to talk a little bit about mission goals, right? A lot of our mission statements, right, are about forming students, like preparing students for, you know, lifetime, to be lifelong learners. But if we're going to be lifelong learners, right, there's no teachers, no explicit teachers, there's no grades once we graduate for the last time. You know, all of us right now, like here, right, like we don't have people who are like constantly giving us little report cards and telling us we got an A in this or that or the other. There's assessing, sure, absolutely, but nothing quite the same as, you know, what we get in a class, right? And if we want to learn something, it's kind of on us to figure it out. And it's kind of on us to figure out if we've learned it. So if we want to learn something new right now in our grown-up lives, we have to be able to have the skill to know, yes, I know how to do this. I am now totally capable of rewiring my ceiling fan, for example. And if I'm not, I might hurt something, right? So I better be able to know if I've learned. So if we're trying to transform our students into these lifelong learners, we have to teach them how to become independent of us. And that means designing our courses for progressive independence. That's, I think, the title of a different workshop that I've developed for something else. So what we want is we want to cultivate these dispositional skills. We want to strengthen these cognitive skills. And we also want to recognize that where students are when they come into our classes is really not where they need to be if we're going to be transforming them through their college education to be lifelong learners. So this is one reason, if we needed another one, to work for metacognition in our classes, is it helps our students to become those lifelong learners we say that we're trying to create or to produce. There's a justice goal here as well, right? So teaching for metacognition also helps to make part of the hidden curriculum less hidden or more visible. So a lot of our students are, like, I'm assuming that a lot of you who have been teaching online classes, especially in this pandemic time, have been hearing, and if not about your classes, then about other people's classes, basically a criticism like this: I had to teach myself. I had to do all the, like, I had to teach myself everything in the class, and I'm not a teacher, so like, what am I supposed to do? Well, that gets back to the independence thing from the previous slide, but also our students don't realize, and again, there's pretty good reasons why they don't realize, that the majority of post-high school learning happens outside the classroom. So, I mean, the way our accreditation works is that, you know, they get some time with us in a synchronous class, and then they're supposed to be spending about 6 hours outside of the classroom on studying and learning on their own. Well, most students have learned pretty quickly once they got to college that they don't need as much time as like our accreditation bodies say that they need. But now that we're teaching online and a lot of the responsibility has to go on the students, they're being asked to do what they already should have been doing. It's just, it has never been made super explicit, or the stakes for it haven't been quite as high. So students don't understand exactly what they're supposed to be doing in college that's different from high school. They're told things like, well, it's going to be a lot harder. It's going to be a lot different. But those are really vague, unhelpful words. Different how? Harder in what way? So by teaching these specific skills and by strengthening their metacognition, what we're doing is we're helping to make some of the unstated norms of college level learning a lot more stated and therefore easier to attain, especially for those who are first generation students. Also an effectiveness goal. So how many of you would like to get better results but with less effort and less time in your classes? I feel like I should be doing this in like a midnight infomercial or something right now. We can get way more powerful learning from our students by doing less busy work on our part, by designing our classes for these skills, right? So students know they're supposed to understand stuff, but they don't know how they're supposed to know when they've understood. So what is a clue to them that they've understood? So, I mean, in a text-based class, when we say, oh, do the reading, they're like, okay, great, I did the reading. My eyes passed over every single word, so therefore I did the reading. And then we talk to them, and they have no idea what they just read. They can't explain it to anyone. They're not able to use it for anything. Did they do the reading? I mean, depends on what you mean by that, right? They certainly didn't understand it. And so just passing your eyes over text is not enough to say that you understand. So we need to teach students how to test their understanding. And this is also going to come up even more in session 2, where we talk about specific things students can do. And one of the top things that students can do to test their own understanding is to teach it to other people. And that could be their classmates in small groups or in study groups. That could be in very short little presentations in the class, especially really informal ones. When I do in-class learning, I have my students kick off our class discussion. Every student has to kick off at least once. They're not responsible for teaching the reading. They're just responsible for getting us started. But that also means, like, they all prepare far more for the class where they're kicking off discussion than they do for any other class. And it's a signal to them that they can level up, and they do. So teaching students ways that they can level up, I mean, I'm assuming that all of us who are educators found that we learned things way faster when we started teaching than we did in our classes when we were taking them. Or at least that's a common thing to happen. So we can teach our students how to know that they've learned something. And that's also a way that we can get more done in our classes, but with less micromanaging, which saves more time for us. Welcome back, everyone. So I'd like to hear about the things that you were discussing, also just where you are now. So the floor is yours. Tell me what you were just discussing. Tell me what more you're looking for, what you're hoping for in the next sessions, what you're going to level up, etc. Yeah, James.
So I think that, you know, we all say the same thing about, you know, there's not enough time to get all of this into our classroom. Like again, I have licensing exams that the students are looking ahead to, and those are multiple choice, so they want to stay in that multiple choice mindset. But at the same time, they need that holistic performance to relate to their patients and to apply the information to their patients. So I try, I try to inspire that thought a little bit by, I don't know, telling them about the importance of their future careers, using quotations to get them to think outside the box. But I think that it's kind of a systemic problem that how do we, how do we inspire that kind of thinking, that kind of systems-based thinking, with the limited resources we have and the mindsets the students have. And so those are the thoughts that are going on in my head about I kind of can see how to inspire students on a one-on-one basis, but when I'm in front of a classroom of 120 students, what's the way to do that? And it becomes complicated.
Yeah, fair. Anyone else with stuff that they want to share to add to that, to turn to something a little bit different? Because we're going to keep coming back to that throughout the next sessions as well.
I think a lot of us are sort of at the in the same position where we understand the need for metacognition and the need for sort of higher level understanding in students, but we're fighting against sometimes a testing system that, like James was talking about, that either we have to adhere to like he does, or that students have gone through and sort of taught them how to study in a particular way, and also the sort of the way fighting against and fixing the way students have been taught to learn. Yep. Up to now, that they fight against forcing them to think a little bit more deeply. Yes. And I think that's something that no matter how much I tell them, hey, you should be doing this, I'm hoping that I get a few skills to not just tell them how to do it, but maybe show them or sort of force them down that path, because I think we're all sort of fighting that game.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I'm going to keep emphasizing is that we have to design for what we want our students to do, which means they're not going to like it, certainly not initially. And I think if we try to just inspire, it's not going to work. So on the one hand, I would say that my students, for example, end up learning a lot in my classes, and I've got ways of being able to see this. But students, and one of the things that I struggle with and that I have struggled with is that for about the first half of the semester that students are in my classes, they are really uncomfortable because everything I'm doing is basically the opposite of what they've been doing in classes up until they've been taking until they take mine. And it means that they feel very disoriented. They feel like they have no idea how to learn or how to understand that they're doing well, and my telling them that they're doing well isn't working. So I have to be okay with some level of that, but I'm still looking for ways to make them feel less terrified about their grades. So we're going to talk more specifically about what we can do to help with students in the next session. And absolutely feel free to send me either questions or scenarios or the things you want to level up so I can build them into our workshop next time as best I can. And we're going to be doing a lot more in the next 2 sessions where it's a lot less of me talking and a lot more of us just kind of working like a mastermind where we're working on specific problems. But the things that we can do to require active learning, that require them to do the work before and after class, so that in class we can be doing a lot more of the synthesis and the analysis and the evaluation, and teaching them how to do it, but also incentivizing it. These are going to be some of the things that I'm going to be suggesting and promoting, but I'm also going to be I'm really eager to hear about ways that you've also done this that might be a little bit different than the ways that I have. Thank you all so much for showing up, for being so participatory, and engaged with what we've been discussing. I'm really looking forward to hearing about what you've been thinking about and working over a month from now. And send me any questions or comments so that I can make the next sessions even stronger and better.